Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all comfortably seated and ready for a very interesting session on Buddhism. Again, I would remind the people here at the Clark, please, please, please use the microphone which is brought to you. It's the only way the people in Great Barrington can hear these questions. So please wait till the microphone is brought to you. Those at the Clark obviously just speak up. You can be picked up by the central mic in the room. Buddhism contains so many important and diverse branches that it's going to be a challenge for our lecturer to do more than scratch the surface of this vast and important religion. But if anybody can do this, it should be our speaker today, the Reverend Monson Paul Naumann. He's a member of the interdisciplinary faculty in Asian Studies at Bard College at Simon's Rock. And he is an abbot of the Tendai Shu New York Betzwin. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that properly, I hope I am. And in June of 2008, he was appointed Secretary General of the Betzwin, which is responsible for teaching and training people for ordination to represent Tendai Buddhism in the West. Now, Buddhism is a philosophy that encompasses many different and complex traditions. There's many beliefs and many practices. It is based, apparently, on the 5th century teachings of Siddhartha Gautama on the Indian subcontinent. It's a religion that rapidly spread from India into all parts of Tibet, China, Japan, and throughout Southeast Asia. And there are hundreds of millions of adherents, and increasingly numbers moving into Europe and North America. We sincerely appreciate Monson Naumann's participation in this program, especially since each of our faculty does so pro bono. Paul, it is a humble but deeply felt token of our appreciation that I present you.
Thank you.
So that you can have your tea okay. in this very famous Holly mug. Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Monson Paul Naumann.
Good afternoon. Is it afternoon? Yeah, it's afternoon. Before I get started, two things. You're welcome to ask questions, or if there's an important comment to make as we go along, you're welcome to do that. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. Probably just to facilitate that, you might want to raise your hand so those who have to bring you the mic can see where you are. This afternoon, and by the way, we are going until 6 o'clock today, right? That's what I've scheduled it for. We'll have one break at 3 o'clock if that's okay with everybody. We're going to start first with a theoretical framework and then go on to a very traditional way of presenting the Buddhist tradition. The Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. We'll have a short conclusions and then a broader question and answer period. We deal with the theoretic framework. I want to start with a very basic notion, and that is that when we, excuse me, when we think of religion in the West, most of us are coming either from a Christian tradition, and that could be Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Baptist, whatever it may be, Jewish tradition, Reform, Orthodox, Hasidic, etc., or Muslim. And I understand that last year you talked about Western religions, Western traditions, and so you have some familiarity with that. But in the West, and those three traditions are referred to as the Abrahamic traditions. And in the West, those three traditions are all somewhat exclusive, meaning that they're based upon the sole belief in that particular tradition. You know, I come from a Jewish background. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad is an important aspect of that. Hear, O Israel, Lord my God, the Lord is one, is the very basis for that tradition. If you don't adhere to that notion of belief, then you're not a Jew. And it also helps to have a Jewish mother and a few other things. But it's exclusivist in that respect. In the same way that if you're a Christian, then you have to have a belief in Jesus Christ as a Lord and Savior. If you're Muslim, you have a particular belief regarding Muhammad and Allah. They're based upon belief. Buddhism, by contrast, or actually the Dhammic traditions, and the Dhammic traditions, in much the same way we have three traditions in the West that are the Abrahamic traditions, we have three in Asia, and those are Buddhism, Jain, and Buddhism. Those are the three. They share certain characteristics. They're very different in some ways, in the same way that Judaism is different from Christianity. But they share other characteristics. And so we group them together like that. And one of the things about Buddhism specifically is that it doesn't require belief. That's not to say that Buddhists don't have belief, or beliefs, plural, but it doesn't require a belief to be a Buddhist. In the same way that the Abrahamic traditions require a belief in God, Hashem, Allah. Buddhism, by contrast, is non-theistic. There is no belief in God. If one has a belief in God, you can bring it along, but it's not necessary. And when you look at Hinduism and Jain, they have a pantheistic belief. But their gods are not monotheistic. They're not capital G gods. They're small g gods. They're more like, more in the sense of the Roman gods, if you will, in that context. Second is that, as I implied a few moments ago, the Buddhist path has many varieties. And so when I was speaking just a moment ago about non-belief in a monotheistic God, and that one is very often a non-theist as opposed to an atheist who would argue against the existence of God. Buddhists don't argue against the existence of God, they just say it's not what I'm addressing. There's a real difference between being a non-theist and an atheist. Within the context of Buddhism, there is a very wide variety of systems in place. And we're going to discuss that to a certain extent this afternoon. In the South, you find Theravadins, and we'll be going over the definitions of that later. You find Theravadins, and they tend to be much more devoted to a singular type of path that does not include other deities other than Shakyamuni Buddha, who is the historical character. On the other hand, within the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions that we'll again talk about, there's a belief in many different types of deities. I won't refer to them as gods because we have a preconceived notion of what a god is coming from our tradition. And that's not the preconceived notion that the peoples in Asia have about these beings. We see that they're often translated as gods, but that's usually a Westerner who's translating it. And so they're translating it from their framework, their mental framework of our culture. But the varieties of Buddhism are as diverse. You know, think about a Greek Orthodox metropolitan, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, having a conversation with Jerry Falwell. There is that great a diversity in Buddhism also. And each of those would find it very curious to have that conversation, I'm sure, and somewhat uncomfortable. In a similar way, in Buddhist traditions, they would find it interesting to have that conversation. Let's say someone who's a Theravadan in Thailand talking to the Dalai Lama on one hand, or a Tibetan leader On one hand, they would find it very interesting, but they don't necessarily share certain characteristics of a way of having a common conversation. When we look at religion in Asia and Euro-America, one of the distinctions that we'll make is that my wife, who's Japanese, often comments that when she came to the United States to go to college when she was a young woman, and can you imagine a person going from Tokyo to going to Chadron, Nebraska? Talk about culture shock. But she was just amazed, excuse me, she was just amazed that people, one of the very first questions they had, first they'd say, well, where are you from? And then they would say, well, what's your religion? I guess that the people in Nebraska didn't hear you don't talk about religion and politics. And what was the other one you don't talk about? I don't remember. We don't talk about that. But she said that was just amazing to her. And she would say, inevitably, she'd say, well, I don't really have a religion. And they'd say, well, you don't have a religion. And then based upon who was asking her, there would be somebody visiting her the next night to give her religion. Now, there's nothing better than a blank slate, right? And the reason is because there's a misunderstanding from an Asian perspective as to what religion means. If you are a child going to school in Thailand, or a child going to school in Japan, or in India, what we would refer to as religion is part of your culture. It's embedded in the culture, and it's not distinct from that culture. We live in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, and so it's a fair question to say, well, are you Jewish, are you Christian, are you Muslim, are you Seventh-day Adventist, whatever it may be, because it gives us some way, perhaps, of thinking we understand what that person is. And from an Asian perspective, typically the society that they live in, if you're in Japan, as an example, when you're in Japan, when you're a child in school, the figures that you learn about in school, in the same way that we'd learn about Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, political figures like that, or Henry David Thoreau and other figures that were important in our formation of our country, for them, those figures are very often religious figures. And they learn about Saicho, the founder of my particular school of Buddhism, in the same way as you would have learned about Thomas Jefferson. And that person has a similar place in that society. And I think that that's a distinction that we have to realize. And so, yes, Buddhism is a religion from an anthropological perspective. That is to say that it has a hierarchy, it has a set of a canon, it has scriptural works, it has practices, it has all the things that would constitute a religion. On the other hand, remember that I'm defining that as an anthropologist from the West. If you're coming from Asia, you wouldn't necessarily define Hinduism or Buddhism in Asia as a religion. You would see it as part of your culture. And we'll explore some of that as we go on. What is Buddhism? Well, to begin with, the reason I underlined the ism there is that would indicate a belief in Bud. We assume it's Buddha. And I just said that Buddhism doesn't require belief. No one in Asia, there's no translation of Buddhism, because that would mean belief in Buddha, or the study of Buddha. I guess I would be a Buddhist or a Buddhism scholar because I do study Buddhism. But typically the term that's used is either the Buddha Dharma, and I'll explain that in a few minutes, the Buddhist path. In Japanese, there's a wonderful term which is Butsudo. And I think Chris Coggins was here, was it last week or the week before, talking about Taoism. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, if you look at the Japanese character of Butsudo, which is the term that they would use, Butsu is the same as the Buddha, or just Buddha, and Do is the same character as the character for Tao, the way. So it literally means the way of the Buddha. That's literally what it means, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. At the time of Shakyamuni Buddha's life on earth, and for the several hundred years after, they would refer to it as sasasana. That's what they would refer to as Buddhism, as sasasana, which just means following a path, following this path. That's literally what it meant. When we discuss Asian traditions, and I think it's true in all of them, and it's certainly very true in Buddhism, we have to recognize that in the West, we make a distinction between history and mythology. And from our perspective, as people living in a secular society, we want to know about the history. And I've often heard people say, well, what did Shakyamuni Buddha really say? Or I want to read only what he really wrote. Well, the first words of Shakyamuni Buddha weren't committed to paper until about 200 years after he had died, to begin with. So it would be difficult to really know what he actually said. But there's incredible mythologies that have tales about what he said. And the very nature of the scriptural works, which are called sutras, one of the characteristics of a sutra is that it always begins, "Thus did he speak," as though whatever's being read was given as a discourse specifically by Shakyamuni Buddha at one time or another. However, in the West, we get tied up in this whole notion of, well, what did he really say? If you're in Asia, that's less important. What has been handed down to us and what do we gain from that is what is important, not what that particular character happened to say. You know, we have some records that give us to believe that this is how he thought about something. This is what he may have said about something. You know, sometimes I feel we ought to say he allegedly said, or he, you know, we should start the sutra, allegedly thus did he speak, as opposed to give the impression that this is what was actually said. But there's this melding of mythology and history, which I think is really quite beautiful. It's not that it reduces the perspective of faith to reject or to accept. It's just that it's told in such a way that it can excite the imagination. We can understand it perhaps even better than just what the actual words are. Any questions about any of this theoretical framework before I begin? That goes for Great Barrington also. I was told that I have to keep asking Great Barrington because they don't know that I'm necessarily asking the question to them. When we talk about Buddha, you'll often hear someone say, the Buddha. And we have to make a distinction between the person and the conception. The historic person, as we were told, was Siddhartha Gautama, who was born, depending upon which set of histories we choose to read, between either 560 to 480 BCE or between 460 to 380 BCE. I mean, that's about 100 years difference. I'm not sure that it makes a heck of a lot of difference in terms of the reality of his life. Once he became awakened, and we'll talk about that in a second, he became Shakyamuni Buddha. Buddha is a term that means awakened one. And Shakyamuni, Shakya is the clan that he belonged to. And Muni refers to the fact he was a very revered person within that clan. In fact, he's often described as a prince. He was actually of the Kshatriya caste, because of course India had in beginnings of a caste system at the time of his life. It became much more reified and developed at a later time. But when he was born, which was actually in Nepal, Lumbini, Nepal, right close to the India and Nepal border, what is today Nepal. At the time it was still part of, it was an Indian kingdom. When he was born to a very wealthy warrior caste. In other words, his father was equivalent to a minor king of that area. And he was then groomed to be a king. And one of the wonderful mythologies is that his father had been visited by a seer some sort of fortune teller previous to his birth, when Shakyamuni Buddha was, before he was born, and told that he was, meaning the person of the Buddha, to become Siddhartha Gautama, was either going to be a very famous and powerful king or a very famous religious, spiritual figure, would be the correct term. Well, his father thought to himself, you know, it's wonderful that we have people who are going to be wonderful spiritual figures, but what my kingdom needs is another king. And so he, in fact, segregated him from the greater world so that he would be protected from these other influences and given everything that he'd want, so he wouldn't want to leave it. And I won't go into a long story about this, except to say that it was through seeing people who were being born, children being born, through people getting older, from people who were becoming sick, and through people who were dying, that his father tried to hide him from those things, but he had seen them anyway. And so he had these essential existential questions. Well, what does life mean? I see these children being born, and I see people getting older, and they suffer and they die. Well, what's it all mean? It's not unlike the questions we all ask throughout our lifetimes. And so he left the plush palace and set out for 6 years and studied with various teachers and referred to as a shramana, these wandering monks and nuns. They were renunciants. They were people who said, I'm leaving my family and going out to do it. Now, at the time of his leaving, Shakyamuni Buddha had a wife and a child. And I suspect the reality is we probably had wives and children because that was the norm at that time, but we're only told about one specific wife and one specific child. And he wasn't really a deadbeat dad when he left because he was his family were wealthy landowners and royalty. They were the elite of the culture, so his family was well taken care of. And if we could fast forward a little bit, his mother, it's actually his stepmother, because his mother died at his birth, but his stepmother became one of his disciples. And his son, Rahula, whose name, by the way, means tether. One is tethered to something, so his name was a tether. That's what tethered Shakyamuni Buddha from awakening while he was still living at home, so to speak. Rahula and his stepmother actually both became disciples, and Rahula, along with another figure, Ananda, became his closest assistants. So he left the palace, spent 6 years wandering, and it might be of interest to some of the people here that one of the people he studied with was a yogi. And so he practiced yoga for many years and realized that wasn't the path to his personal awakening. And he studied with people who held very different views, some aesthetic and some very almost hedonistic, which leads to one of his basic teachings that we'll discuss. After about 6 years, he had studied with these various teachers, and he had a small following of his own at that point. About 5 men were then treating him as a teacher and following him around. And he sat under what's referred to as the Bodhi tree. The Bodhi is Sanskrit for awakening or enlightenment. And he sat under that tree and for a time, and that's credited with bringing his awakening. Now, it's important to recognize here that people say, oh, so he sat under the Bodhi tree and that was his awakening, as though sitting for a week, sitting meditation for a week would do it. No, that previous 6 years leading up to that point conditioned him to be ready for the awakening. And while he may not have chosen to follow yoga, he may not have chosen to follow some of those other teachers, their teachings still had an impression upon him and led him to the particular path that he then followed after that. And that awakening experience is really noteworthy because can you imagine that you have been wandering for 6 years in nothing but very simple robes with a begging bowl and a food bowl and a water bowl, You've got just a few implements to carry with you, and the only way that you can get by is by begging. You sit under the tree, and all of a sudden, boom, everything becomes immediately into focus. What is the meaning of life? Where does it come from? What is it? What is this? Answers to those existential questions. So immediately following that awakening, he was approached by several people. They could see that he looked a little bit different. And I characterize his first words to his disciples after his awakening as blah, 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 blah. He couldn't express anything. How do you explain something like that? How do you condense into a few words what is this meaning? And that's an important aspect of Buddhist teachings, because ultimately it's experiential. It's not intellectual. When I have this conversation with you, it's through our intellect that we're having this conversation. And so Buddhist teachings were inherently experiential. You had to experience it for yourself. You could listen to a teacher define, here's what the path might be, but ultimately for your own awakening, you have to experience this process. Parinirvana is the next major route along this. He taught then for about 40 years. And we have a wonderful, there's over 3,500 sutra, 3,500 scriptures. In the Mahayana tradition, there's about 2,500 scriptures. In the Theravada tradition, over 5,000 sutras that are published, that we know about, that are discourses. Some he may have had a hand in, at least the discourse of delivering it, and some were made up totally without his input. But there's about 5,000 books that cover that 40 years that have been collected. The parinirvana is the time of his death. And so it's told in the early Buddhism, the Nikaya traditions, those traditions right around the time of his life, that upon his death, he then became a Buddha, meaning a fully enlightened one. And that'll make more sense as we go along. Any questions from anybody up to this point? Am I being extremely clear or being extremely dense? Clear. Okay. I just never know. Then there's the idea of the Buddha as a conception. So when we talk about the Buddha, we're usually talking about Shakyamuni Buddha. But then a Buddha can be anyone who's enlightened. Anyone who's enlightened is a Buddha. And by tradition, depending upon which tradition you look at, there were many, many Buddhas before Shakyamuni Buddha. It's just that he got all the good press. And there are many Buddhas then after Shakyamuni Buddha. Buddha can also mean the awakening present in all beings. The sense of awakening that resides within each of us. By that tradition, by the latter tradition, the Mahayana tradition, everyone here has at least the seed of awakening that resides within them. And it's not, some traditions believe that you attain awakening. Other traditions, Buddhist traditions, believe that you manifest awakening. In other words, if it's already in you, then there's nothing to attain. You're already a Buddha, you just don't know it. And so you act not as a Buddha, but you act as something else. Then there's the Buddha that's present in all the cosmos. This isn't a God notion. My background, by the way, I have two different graduate traditions. One is in biological anthropology, and the other is in Asian studies, specifically Buddhism. The scientist in me sees this Buddha that's present in all the cosmos as what we might refer to as dark matter. And I'm not being facetious when I say that. It's what holds the universe together. That's our current understanding of what dark matter is. If we didn't have dark matter, the other molecules would spin out of their place. It has a kind of gravitational field all its own, for instance. We don't know what it is. This is all theoretical stuff. But that's how I perceive it. And then there are the 5 Buddha families. And we're not going to go into all of these because we only have 6 hours this afternoon. There's the 5 Buddha families that the medicine Buddha, the Buddha of what's called the Eastern Paradise, Amitabha Buddha, the Buddha of the Western Paradise, they have specific characteristics. When I talked about the differences between some of that early Buddhism and latter Buddhism, we see these deities. And these Buddhas are viewed as manifestations of that original Buddha. One of the other things to keep in mind is that often when we talk about a Buddha, we picture this fellow. We don't see really a picture there of the Buddha right now, but we see this fellow sitting there. By definition, a Buddha has no gender. It has no sex. Because it's beyond the notion of reproduction. It's beyond the notion of needing sex. And it's beyond the conceptualization of needing gender. Those are necessary for the mundane world, thank goodness. But it's not necessary for a Buddha. So a Buddha, by definition, does not have a gender or a sex. Then there's the Dharma. And the Dharma is sometimes defined as the universal law of nature. In many ways, the Dharma is synonymous with the Tao. Thinking about Chris's presentation. In many ways, the Dharma is synonymous with the Tao. And what we find actually later, by about the very shortly after Shakyamuni Buddha's death, within 100 years or so, we find Buddhism, and we'll talk about that, spreading to other parts of Asia. And we know that Buddhism infused a great deal into Taoism, and Taoism infused a great deal into Buddhism. There's a synchrony. And then later on, we see Chinese Buddhism picking up Confucianist ideas. But this idea of the universal law of nature is really not so different than the Tao. The very first words in Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, the way it can be told is not the constant way, the names that can be named are not the constant names. That you could use directly out of a Buddhist sutra. The teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, which apply an understanding of this law, the laws of nature, to be the conduct of human life. So part of what Dharma is presenting is how do we take this law of nature and apply it to human existence, our day-to-day existence. And the third way is the Dharma is a phenomena and or its properties. And we'll discuss some phenomena a little bit later. But the Dharma means all of these things. And we'll start with a very short philosophy. Among the first teachings that Shakyamuni Buddha gave, which doesn't mean it's most important because they were the first, but the most essential or elemental teachings, in that sense, are the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is the truth of dukkha. And everyone has probably heard it referred to as Buddhism is dealing with suffering. Well, sometimes dukkha is translated as suffering. I choose to use the word discontentedness. Because when we think of suffering, we think of overt suffering, such as what happens every morning when I get out of bed and feel like I'm 95 years old. That's a kind of suffering. Or the suffering that we saw going on in Bosnia-Herzegovina or Rwanda or those various hot spots around the world. I can't for a moment imagine what it's really like to be in one of those places. But that's true suffering. The suffering I'm talking about is more like severe neuroses, anxiety, depression. And according to Shakyamuni Buddha, that form of suffering is due to attachment. When we think about attachment, I mean, we might be attached to our partner or our spouse, And that's a form of attachment on our children. But the attachment he was talking about is the attachment going back to those first 4 things that he saw: birth, old age, illness, and death. That we're attached to this body. Sorry, Great Barrington, for hitting the mic. We're attached to this body. And this body then leads to those other things, and that leads to that angst as we age, as we watch our children grow. The anxiety we experience for watching our small one go out by him or herself the first time to school, or the first time they cross the street. The anxiety that we experience when we're going off to college the first time. Whatever it might be, that's that suffering. That's the dukkha. Now, samudaya are those causes, the things that I was just talking about. Those first 2 things, dukkha and samudaya, were actually present in all the Dhammic traditions. So those ideas are present also in Jain and Hindu belief systems. And it's partly what causes the Dhammic, that's one of the things that holds the Dhammic traditions together as they are. The third thing is nirodha, which means cessation of suffering. And here we have a departure from those other Dhammic traditions. Hinduism is looking at one way to deal with that suffering and its causes. Buddhism is looking at another way of dealing with it. And it's saying that, in fact, we can cease that suffering. It's possible. That's a really big deal. If I can go back for a second to the Indian subcontinent, we'll say 400 BCE, Karen Armstrong, in her book Buddha, maintains that she ties Buddhism in with what's referred to as the axial age. And the axial age was an age of great transformation that existed throughout the known world at that time, meaning Greece, Asia, that part of the world, in which you had these great religious leaders rise up. And it rose up because it was a time in which agriculture, which had taken place originally several thousands of years earlier, and in India about 2,000, 2,500 years earlier, had reached its fruition. And it caused both an ecological and a social rapid change. And so these ideas of suffering, the ideas of what are the causes and the cessation of suffering were a result of that great social and ecological cataclysm. You had the first city-states developing in India at this time. You had the manifestation of stratification, the caste system developing at that time. You had the idea of labor, which was very specific. So previous to that time, if you were a farmer, that's what you did, and everybody was a farmer, and you didn't have specialization. But now you had people developing pottery. You had people developing cooking utensils. You had people developing plows, specialized tasks, which led to then stratification, social stratification, which led to labor and slavery of a very different type than had existed before. And this would have led to a different type of solution than if we're looking at a time 3,000 years earlier. And it's referred to as Magga, which is the Eightfold Noble Path. And we're going to spend a few moments discussing this. Before I go on, are there any questions about anything that I've said so far? Someone has a hand up in the back over there.
Yeah, what happens to the teachers? The teachers that Buddha studied with, what were their points of view, if any?
What happened?
And are there teachers that are teaching the Four Noble Truths during this period of evolution?
Okay. The question is, what happened to the teachers? And are there a teacher, in other words, what happened after Shakyamuni Buddha left them? And were there other teachers that were teaching the Four Noble Truths? The answer to the first is that I guess you might say, it's really curious, you might say that those first teachers, we look at America today, I'll back up for a second, we look at America today, and one of the things that characterizes our spiritual journeys in America today is what's referred to as the grocery store form of religious seeking. We go into the marketplace often, and we look for that tradition which seems to fit us. It may be, so we may have been raised congregational, and we become Hare Krishna. Or we're raised Roman Catholic and we become Jewish, or vice versa, right? Because there's a big marketplace of ideas that are out there that we can choose from. And some would even argue that that's a really good thing. It adds a kind of vitality to our spiritual lives. Well, India was pretty much the same at the time. So people would spend time with one teacher and then go on to another. We know the names of some of those teachers that he had because they were well known and they went on to publish other works. And I said one of the traditions he studied was yoga. It didn't resemble the yoga that they practice at Kripala Center, which is based upon a specific type of yoga, but it was a spiritual-based yoga in which it's the unification of body, speech, and mind. And what he rejected from the yogic tradition was the yogic tradition asserts the eternal soul, that there is an eternal soul. And he rejected that notion that there is no eternal soul. And we're going to discuss what that means a little bit later. But just to say that that was why he chose to leave that particular teacher. He didn't really have that belief. Did they have the Four Noble Truths? Well, they had the first two. They had the idea of dukkha and the idea of sumaya, or suffering and the causes of suffering. His teaching is what gave us the cessation of the suffering, because previous to that, some of the traditions that he was studying believed that you would just go through a certain number of lifetimes, and each lifetime would go higher than the next. Or some would believe, based upon what you did in this lifetime, you'd be lower or higher, and you had lived through a certain number of lifetimes before being elevated outside of that suffering. So basically what you had to do is continue to be reborn, and we'll discuss rebirth later. But just as an example, that's where some of those teachers are. We have a pretty good understanding of some of those teachers at this time. And then there was another school that was basically very similar to skeptics in Greek philosophy. So, we see some of that. It's just that those particular teachers didn't resonate with him, except for that period of time he was with them for a couple of years at a time, perhaps. But he went on to then found his own ideas, which he formulated and became what we think of as Buddhism today. Did that answer the question? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. We're going to discuss the Eightfold Noble Path in a second. But one of the other things that he sat and recognized under the Bodhi tree, and this is important, was dependent origination, or is dependent origination. And the first of these, and there's actually 12 steps of dependent origination. I won't go through those. And by the way, Buddhism is filled with 10 of this, 4 of that, 3 of these, 26 of those, 30. And the reason is because Buddhism was what came about during a pre-literate culture. Everything was an oral tradition, and it had to be memorized. We memorize lists better than we memorize narrative. And so the reason that you see so many numbers of things is that if I want to tell you about the Four Noble Truths, I'll probably do this. Well, the first is the second, the third, the fourth, right? Here's the Eightfold Noble Path. This is the first, that's the second, that's the third. It provides us a way of remembering them. Well, the first idea of dependent origination is that all phenomena arise dependent on causes and conditions and lack intrinsic being. Now does anybody want to give an idea as to what that means? No, I don't blame you. So I'm just going to skip it and go on. Just kidding. It means that when we think about the Abrahamic traditions, and you think about the Torah, when you think about the Christian Bible, what's the first thing in Genesis? Is creation. And where did creation come from? Well, some would argue God. If you happen to be a physicist, you might argue the Big Bang. You know, there's some discussion about that, let's say. And this is saying that nothing arises independent of something else. There can be no ultimate causation like a God that causes it to go boof. It just arises. There's a line of causation. And when we look within the individual, dependent origination looks at the body as the original cause, which gives rise to sensation, which in turn gives rise to emotion, which in turn gives rise to thoughts, etc., on down the line. And this is saying that even for us as individuals, we lack an intrinsic being aside from that chain of causation. It's one of those things that, again, it's more experiential. And you're certainly welcome to ask me more questions about it, and I'm certainly welcome to say, got me beat. But there it is. That's where it comes from. The second is, there is nothing which comes into being under its own power or volition. Everything is caused by something else. Cause and effect. There can be nothing that is coming from nothing. And the third is that Shakyamuni Buddha came to realize dependent origination. This was his first thought while he was under the Bodhi tree, the profound truth of the dependent origination. Dependent origination. Everything depends upon something else for its origin. And you say, we can get into the theoretical notion. Well, what gave rise to the universe, or what gave rise to the cosmos? And the answer would be, well, there have been many cosmoses before. We just happen to be in this one right now. Matter of fact, the term that you often see in Buddhism is there are many kalpas, or kotis of kalpas. And a kalpa is viewed as, there have been kalpas of cosmoses, or kalpas of universes. And a kalpas in Indian Sanskrit mythology is defined as, imagine the number of grains in the Ganges, and each grain is its own universe. That's how many universes there have been before. And so when somebody finally pinned down Shakyamuni Buddha and said, okay, so what came before that? His answer was, he really could have been a politician. His answer was, why are you asking me? You should be asking an astrologer. I don't know. Simple as that. I don't have to answer that. He would redirect the question. Because, in a sense, it's unanswerable. We can posit what we think it might be, but we don't know. He didn't claim to be omniscient. He wasn't a god. He was a person. A person who was mythologized, but he was a person. So this idea of dependent origination was extremely important in terms of some of the other ideas we're going to discuss. Does anybody have anything they want to ask about this? Okay. Something else that's important are the three marks of existence. And these are the three characteristics that are shared by all sentient beings. The three characteristics that are shared by all sentient beings. And let me define sentient being, because somebody was going to ask that question. A sentient being, it depends upon what type of Buddhism you practice as to what sentient beings are. If you happen to be a Buddhist who practices in Thailand or Sri Lanka or Cambodia, a sentient being is any being which has mobility. Animals, essentially, fish, anything that has mobility is sentient. It means that it is aware of its environment in that sense. If you happen to be East Asian Buddhist, such as Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and China, sentient beings refer to virtually anything that you can touch and see. The wood in this podium would be considered sentient. And you might say, well, where's its mind? Where's its consciousness? Well, it was once a tree. I mean, I could point to someone's skeleton sitting here and say, well, that was once sentient. You say, well, where is the tree's mind? Where's its consciousness? Well, within East Asian Buddhism, and we'll talk about this again a little bit later, there's the notion that even that tree has the Buddha nature within it, and as such has the capacity for awakening and thus is sentient. Even as it stands there as a tree, you don't understand its consciousness. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have some kind of a animating force within it, a life force within it. When you cut it down, and as I do to burn firewood, we burn the corpse of that tree, but we don't burn its life. Its life was extinguished the moment that we cut it down, or shortly thereafter. In the same way that we can extinguish our own life force when we die, and what's left is our shell. But then the question remains, well, what happened to that life force? So that's how they would argue for sentiency outside of just animals or other critters. And the first mark of existence, and this is really important, is anicca. And the words I'm using, by the way, are Sanskrit. Anicca is inconsistency or impermanence. Essentially, everything changes. Nothing stands still. And from Buddhist teachings, it would be argued that this is partly what leads to our dissatisfactoriness, our dukkha. I'm probably of an age similar to many of you. I'm 63 now. And boy, what would I give to be 30 again, huh? And remember when you were 30? Everything was in front of you, and you couldn't, well, certainly when you were 17, you couldn't wait to be 21, right? And when you're 21, you couldn't wait for the next stage. And then we reach a point in which we want to hold on to that 30 years old. When I was 30 years old, I was running 15 miles a day, you know, turning in 20 miles, 30 miles a day, you know. What a great thing. You know, now I'd be lucky to turn in, 20-minute miles and forget 15 miles a day. That's what we want to hang on to. We want everything to remain the same. We want to have that wonderful experience that we had when we were 25 that we still think back on. We want that to be static. We don't mind when other things change, like when you were, just out of college and barely scraping to get by, perhaps, and your furniture were old orange crates and cinder blocks. That was a good thing to change, right? But we want to hold on to those things that are going to change whether we like it or not. And the next one is dukkha, which we talked about a few minutes ago, dissatisfaction or dis-ease, if you will. And then anatman. Okay, I'm going to jump into this with both feet. Another characteristic of Hindu philosophy is the notion of Atman. And Atman is the self, the eternal self, much like the Christian notion of the soul, right? The Christian notion of the soul among some Christians are that when we die, we're going to go to heaven and we're going to see those we love, for instance, that persists forever. Shakyamuni Buddha explicitly felt that this was barking up the wrong tree. He looked at that as a kind of hanging on, if you will, trying to put permanency into impermanence. And so he felt that what persists is a spirit, but not the person. So John dies, and John Smith is unique. He can never, ever, ever be another John Smith, because that John Smith was the product of all kinds of things. His product of his parents, his siblings, his teachers, his friends, the schools he went to, the neighborhood he lived in, whether, all of those things are what constitute John Smith. We might look at it as like an ego, if you will. That's what John Smith is that combination of stuff. When John dies, John's gone. What persists is a karmic stream. What persists are the kind of imprints upon a flow of consciousness that will go on, but not as John Smith. It's a consciousness which is disembodied, that has no inherent meaning, going back to previous teachings we were looking at. It has no inherent meaning. That non-self is a really difficult notion to wrap our minds around, if you will. And it's one of the things that lead many people to say, well, Buddhism is nihilistic. It believes in suffering, all life is suffering, and it believes in non-self, an-atman. Pretty negative thinking. Well, another way of looking at it is going back to this idea of the Dharma as being laws of nature. The tree grows, I cut the tree down, I use it for firewood. That tree is no more. On the other hand, that tree probably left seeds or shoots, and there's another tree that grows out of it. But the two trees are not the same tree. They're descendants, much like children are descendants from us. They're separate. They've derived from us, but they're separate. So the idea of non-self becomes essential to Buddhism. Now, here's an important thing. In the Theravada tradition in South Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, etc., they put a lot of emphasis on this notion of non-self. The Mahayana doesn't really put as much emphasis upon it. I'm trying to give you the broad spectrum of beliefs here. But it certainly was elemental to Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings. When asked, much like he was asked, well, what was there before the universe? And he said, well, go ask an astrologer, recognizing there were no astronomers. No, he would have said, yeah, there were no astronomers, there were only astrologers. I always get those two mixed up. Who tells our fortune? That's an astrologer, right? Yeah, okay. So he said, go ask an astrologer. Well, when he was asked about non-self, and he explained it, we'll say pretty much the way I just explained it, he said, don't worry about it. That's just another cause of suffering. Why spend a lot of time thinking about it? It's just going to make you unhappy. It's not going to change the condition. Buddhism as a teaching tends to be very pragmatic. Don't worry about it. You don't have to, it's not a riddle to be solved. It's a riddle, but it doesn't have to be solved. I'll go on to the Eightfold Noble Path. The Eightfold Noble Path, the eight are broken into three characteristics. And the first is wisdom. And wisdom means right views. And by right, I'm not saying that there's a right and a wrong. Right just means a better view, not the truth with a capital T view. And what that means when we have a notion of right views are views that are non-dogmatic, views that look at the teachings, Buddhist teachings, in a way that they can be criticized to better understand them. And views that then lead to making our life happier, better. It's not to say you have to be optimistic all the time. That's not what it's saying. That wouldn't be reality. But it's saying holding on to some of these views. Right intention. Now, these are part of wisdom. Right intention is, what do you intend to do? We have opportunities. There was a 6th century Chinese founder of Tiantai Buddhism who referred to 3,000 worlds in one moment. And what that meant was that each moment you have 3,000 choices to make in your life. What do you choose to do? Do you choose to have a life that's going to just be sensually satisfied but spiritually corrupt? Do you choose to have a life which is going to be assist other people? What's your intention? And so that's what it's referring to in right intentions. And any of these we can go into more detail. The second grouping of 3 is ethical conduct. And the first is right speech. Not lying, not spreading dangerous or harmful gossip, not being misleading, not self-aggrandizement, that kind of notion. Right action. We said before, what's your intention? What's the action that's a result of that intention? Many of us have really great intentions, but something happens between the intention and the action. Right? I'm going to go out and I'm going to, well, just on a very mundane level, I'm going to go out and I'm going to mow all the lawn today. But somewhere along the line, I hear the Yankees game on. Oops, there I said it. And there goes mowing the lawn. Right? There's a difference between our intentions and our actions. So making good intentions work with right actions. These should be wholesome. Right actions are things that are going to basically assist others and assist in our own spiritual development. And then right livelihood. You know, some people say, well, these are a lot like the 10 Commandments. And in certain ways they are, I suppose. But it's interesting, in the 10 Commandments you don't find right livelihood. What's a good job? Not just one that brings in money, but what's a job that really assists one with their spiritual path? And at the time that Shakyamuni Buddha was alive, there were certain jobs that were really considered to be wrong livelihood, if you will. Such things as being a butcher, or being and today we don't view being a butcher as a wrong livelihood, but at the time that was one of them. Or being a prostitute would be wrong livelihood. Today, I think it has more to do with social responsibility. Where is your money invested? Is it going to a corporation which manufactures firearms and sells them in third world countries? That would be wrong livelihood. In other words, it's being mindful of where our economy comes from, our personal economy. Being mindful of where our personal economy comes from. Being a professor is theoretically right livelihood. But I don't remember who it was that said that a professor is much more dangerous than a murderer, because a murderer kills one person at a time, whereas a professor can kill 1,000 minds like that. You know? So we have to question whether or not right livelihood is being a professor. Then we have samadhi, or mental discipline, meditation. And the first is right effort. We have right action and right effort. How much effort do you put into something that's taking place? Do you give it a half-hearted try, or do you try wholeheartedly? Right mindfulness. Mindfulness in this context is not the mindfulness we use in the vernacular today, which is to be present every moment, moment to moment to moment. Right mindfulness here meant what's referred to in Sanskrit as shmirti, which is that you're continuously mindful of one's spiritual path and you continuously attempt to be aware of your actions, your intentions, your thoughts, etc., from moment to moment. That's a little bit different than being aware of what you're doing moment to moment. And then the third one is right contemplation. Taken together, these three constitute mental discipline, meditation, and contemplation within a Buddhist context, which again is a little bit different in the spiritual context than they are in sort of in modern life. I'm going to stop with this numbering system pretty soon because otherwise you're all going to be asleep on me and then I'm going to have to make loud noise and that's not really right action. And anyway. Paramita means that which reaches the other shore, or transcendence. And I'm just going to list these. Dana, generosity, to be generous with one's time as well as one's money. And here I have to mention to you a very important message. WAMC is undergoing its fund drive. And Alan Chartok lives right down the road from Simon's Rock College. So he's going to get me. I used to teach at the University of Albany with Alan, and now I just happen to be right down the road from where he lives. So I'm not sure whether I'm stalking him or he's stalking me. But please give to the fund drive. Otherwise, we're going to hear Alan endlessly for the next week. You know, and that certainly is not right mindfulness. And then there's Sheila, which is ethics and morality. And I'm going to go back to this because it's really important in a couple of different ways. Kashante is patience. Patience. What do we mean by patience? And these, by the way, when you look at the Eightfold Noble Path, they're a theoretical framework. The 6 paramitas are what can an individual in Buddhism do? And this is true in all the forms of Buddhism. It's not specific to one particular school. It's true in all the schools of Buddhism. Kashante, I characterize as how many times are you at the grocery store and you've got a carton of milk that you stopped in real quick to get. And so you immediately go to the 15 items or less line. And in that line in front of you is someone who's got 25 items. And you're sitting there with a carton of milk and you're counting the items. She's got 25. It says 15 or less. And you're counting them. And then she gets up and she's ready to pay and she says, well, can I write a check? And she writes the check and the person says, well, do you have a Price Chopper card? Well, no, I don't. And now she's got to go over and she's got to get the check approved and she's got to come back. In the meantime, you were looking next door at that line with all those items going whisking through while you're standing there with one carton. Patience means not only do you not say, lady, what are you doing? But you look at the person and you recognize that they also are suffering. That somehow they missed the point. Somehow they didn't see it. I don't mean they didn't see the sign. They don't connect between their actions and that intention. That's a form of suffering. And so patience gives us the capacity to essentially put the other person in our shoe, or we go into that other person's shoes. You know, perhaps that person ran in and they got a baby waiting in the car. And so they went to the 15 items because they wanted to get out so they don't leave the baby sitting. Now, we can have an argument or a discussion, should they have left the baby in the car, but that's a different discussion, right? That's what we're talking about with patience. It's not just not losing your temper, but it's trying to understand in that particular situation. And then we have virya, or energy and forbearance. How much effort do you put into something, in fact? Dhyana, again, meditation. Prajna, wisdom. You've seen all these before. The last two, meditation and wisdom, and Shila, those three actually come specifically from the Eightfold Noble Path. These others were added at a later time. In other schools of Buddhism, they add 4 others called the 4 virtues, and I'm not going to go into those at this time. The point of these 6 paramitas is that, and here's an interesting little notion, twice a year at it's called Ohigan in Japan, and it comes from the equinox, the time when the night and day are approximately equal length. And it's seen to be a period of time in which there's a greater, the proximity of the spiritual world and the mundane world. And at that time, for a week, 3 days on either side of the actual day of the equinox, we look at these 6 paramitas. We spend time examining them as a way to make them real in our lives, to examine our own actions in this last 6 months and how do our actions stand up regarding generosity, patience, ethics and morality, etc. Another view, another perspective I'm going to give you is the difference between the orthodox versus the vernacular. All those philosophies that I was just talking about, karma, rebirth, well, we'll talk about rebirth in a moment, a few others, there's a distinction between the orthodox and the vernacular. And I'll give you a really, I hope it'll be a good example. When I was first living in Japan, I lived in Japan initially for about 6 years, and I'm in Japan about 3 to 4 months a year, as it is now. But when I was living in Japan full time, one of my teachers, and now a very good friend, his name is Saito Enshin, and Saito-san is a Tendai priest, and there's a period of time in Japanese Buddhism that takes place either in July or August, depending upon where you are, called Obon. And it's a respect for the ancestors period. And you look at that, and that comes specifically from Confucianism. It's where, again, Buddhism and Confucianism overlap. It comes from Confucianism, in fact, and practiced throughout East Asia. And during this period of time, a person goes outside their house, could be an apartment house, a regular freestanding dwelling, whatever, and they make typically a small fire, and they invite those who are deceased to come inside. And for the next 10 days, week to 10 days, depending upon where you are, the spirit of that person spends time in your house. Matter of fact, on your Butsudan, your Buddhist altar, you put out things that the person really liked in life. For my grandfather, I'd have to put Jim Beam whiskey and Camel cigarettes, right? I mean, it's that mundane. It's what did that person really like in their life, you know? And every day somebody speaks to that person. Well, in Buddhism, there's the idea of rebirth, which is that after this lifetime, the spirit is reborn. But not my grandfather. He's not reborn, but his spirit is reborn because my grandfather is extinguished. There is no more. Lee Stewart Kreisel isn't around. Right? However, every year in Japan, most families undergo this tradition. And I said to Saito-san, Saito-san, with Obon, don't we as Buddhists have a notion of rebirth? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, then, why are we as Buddhist priests doing memorial services and ministering to these families at this ceremony? How can you both be reborn and have the spirit coming back to visit them at the same time? He said, oh, it's very easy. Oh, good. I don't think about it. The first is the orthodoxy of rebirth. The second is the vernacular. What do people really do? And in Buddhism, like many traditions, there's a distinction between what is the teaching and what do people really do. And this evening, there's a meditation service at my temple. This evening I'll be doing a Dharma talk. And this evening I'm actually talking about the hot button issues, things like abortion and capital punishment and a few other things like that. Thank goodness there aren't many more things like that, but the hot button issues. And abortion is another one of those things. Buddhists believe that the conceptus, the embryo, is human. From the time that the conception takes place, and as a human biologist I would have to say at the time of the 64th blastocele, that becomes effectively a human. Now, and I'm not making a statement here regarding how I feel about abortion and that. I'm just saying that's how Buddhism looks at it. Having said that, and we know that Buddhists eschew the notion of taking a life. Having said that, if you go to most Japanese Buddhist temples, you'll see little jizo, little figures that look like monks, and often they have a little hat on and a little bib. And they represent the spirit of an aborted fetus. On an orthodox level, abortion is wrong. On a vernacular level, the priest says, as do I, it's wrong to have an abortion, but it's wrong to have the mother bear a child that she can't support, that's unwanted, that's unloved, whatever the situation may be. It's wrong for a family to have to go through that trauma needlessly. So the question isn't, is abortion right or wrong? The question is, where is the most harm? And where this orthodoxy and the vernacular meet is recognizing that as a priest, I can't tell someone else what decision they should make. My colleagues and my friends who are Catholic priests might have one feel about abortion, but they'll have to say to someone, it's wrong to have this abortion, to, someone comes to speak to them, even though they may feel differently. As a Buddhist priest, I say, you have to make the decision, weigh whether this child is going to be loved. If it's not going to be loved, why should it exist? We're not denying it's a child or it's not a child. That's not the issue. The issue is it going to be loved or not? Is it going to be cared for? Is it going to be raised properly? And if it's not, then it's better that it not be born. And so as a Buddhist priest, I'll say, if you choose to have the baby, I'll do a blessing. If you choose to have an abortion, I'll do a memorial service. So that's where the Orthodox and the vernacular meet. Here's some important comments, or concepts. I can see your eyes beginning to roll in the back of your head. So I'm just going to look at this. I'm going to skip over this. I won't include this because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And I didn't form this with enough time for this next part. We have Buddhist practice, which is part of the Dharma. Can anybody here tell me what the primary Buddhist practice is? Anybody tell me what the primary Buddhist practice is? Lady says meditation. Good guess. Any others? Living? Good guess. Any others? Compassion. All the schools of Buddhism would maintain that compassion is the Buddhist practice, that everything else is secondary to that. In a sense, it was a loaded question. But do we practice compassion? Furthermore, do we practice compassion with wisdom? And do we use skillful means to determine how we do that? And compassion, by the way, isn't what we mean in the vernacular quite often. Compassion in the Buddhist context could almost be used as a verb, because it's what actions do we take? What actions do we take to relieve the suffering of someone else? That's what compassion means. And sometimes it means that we have to act in a way that doesn't seem very compassionate. For instance, you may have someone, a family member, who's an alcoholic, and the person chooses to go on the 12-step program or some other program, and they come to you and say, I really need a drink. I really, really need a drink. You don't understand. I really need this drink. Are we being compassionate by giving them the drink? And chances are the person who's asking you thinks you're a real SOB for not giving them that drink. But the compassionate thing is not to give them the drink. So, in that sense, compassion is what is going to help relieve the person's ultimate suffering or their ultimate dukkha. Now, there are many different Buddhist methods which are referred to as practices. The first is, as this young lady said, meditation. And when we talk about meditation, there are many different types of meditation. Another is chanting. In Buddhism, there's often chanting. Sometimes you'll hear chanting of particular mantras, such as Om Mani Padme Hum, or Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, or chanting of sutra. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva doing deep prajna paramita, clearly saw emptiness of all five conditions, thus completely relieving misfortune and pain, and on and on and on and on. As a priest, you have to memorize those. That's why there's so few Buddhist priests. The next, and certainly not many older Buddhist priests. If you don't memorize it but before you're 40, good luck. The next is devotion. When we think of Buddhism in America, especially, we think, as someone said, of meditation. The majority, let me rephrase it a different way. There are probably more people per capita who meditate in the United States than meditate per capita in Asia, even though most of Asia is Buddhist. Because meditation is a method, but it's not the primary method for everyone. And if you live in theocracies such as Sri Lanka or Burma, or, well, Burma's not a theocracy anymore, it used to be, or Thailand, or the exiled community of Tibet or Bhutan, those are all theocracies. It's a state religion. Buddhism is a state religion in those places. And yet, people meditate sometimes, periodically. Every Wednesday night at my small little temple in Canaan, New York, 40, 50 people show up for meditation. Not many temples in Tokyo do 40 or 50 people show up for meditation once a week. Take my word for it. It's devotional. People have a devotion toward the path. The lessons they reach by osmosis, but it's not primarily meditation or chanting. There's some forms that do, for instance, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. They chant Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo for long periods of time. That would be a chanting. Scholarship is one of the practices. As a matter of fact, I come from a tradition in which my teacher, Jishima Sensei, is the 37th in his lineage, or he's the 36th, I'm the 37th, in which we are scholars by definition. That's why I still have some hair up here. Because otherwise I'd have to shave my head, keep my head shaved. But as a scholar, I can keep a little bit of stuff on top. Another form is circumambulation, to walk in meditation, doing a walking meditation, typically around a figure like Amitabha, the Buddha of the Western paradise, while reciting Namo Mitabu, Namo Mitabu, Namo Mitabu, Namo Mitabu, Namo Mitabu, Namo Mitabu, and you're just walking like this and reciting, and do that for hours. That's another type of practice. Pilgrimages, going from point to point over a long distance of time. Within my tradition, there's one type of pilgrimage called a kaihogyo, in which certain monks, not everyone, we all have to do a couple of kaihogyo in our training, which is essentially a marathon. And we start at the top of the mountain, go down to the bottom of the mountain, circle up, and go to the top of the mountain. And it's about 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles. Every single monk in my tradition has to do this. There are some, and we have to do it within about 5 hours. There's a time limit on it. Some choose to do it 1,000 days. You're doing a marathon a day for 1,000 days. And for 100 of those days, you're doing 2 marathons in one day. That's a pilgrimage, an example of a pilgrimage. And then there are ceremonies and rituals. And Buddhist tradition has, depending upon where it is in the world, many, many, many different types of ceremonies and rituals. And you see on there one fellow sitting behind a fire. That's referred to as a goma, which you find in many different Buddhist traditions. It's a fire ritual to burn away one's defilements. And you see other monks, that's Soto Zen, sitting facing the wall while they're meditating. And others in their blue outfits that are up there. And they're an example of a monk and some lay people who are doing chanting practice. So there's many different types of practices that are available to people. And some schools are devoted to one practice, some schools are devoted to others, others incorporate all of them. It really depends upon the particular school of Buddhism. Any questions about any of these? I see several questions. There's a person, looks like a sweatshirt or light shirt there. Oh, okay.
What is, in reference to the pilgrimages and the 25 miles or the 1,000 days, or what other rules are applied to it, what's the end point? What are you trying to accomplish?
Okay. The question is, why does one do something like a kaihogyo of 25 miles? The reason is because the person who's doing that, and I'll explain a little bit more about it in a second, but the answer directly is the person who's choosing to do that is doing that as a way to attain awakening, plain and simple. And they have to stop at 250 spots along the way and take out their beads and rub their beads together and then do a particular mantra. Om bi se ze, bi se ze, om bi se ze, bi se ze. I forget the rest of it. But many different types of mantras. That's why it's hard being a priest when you're older. But there's many different types of mantras that's specific along the way, and they have to memorize the spots, and that's a way to attain awakening. Just to be able to do that, by the way, they have to do a circumambulation process in which they can't even do the kaihogyo until someone else sees a Amitabha Buddha in their eyes. So there's even a precursor where they do this for up to, well, until it happens. It could be months. And even previous to that, they have to do 3,000 prostrations a day for at least 10 days before they even get there. I know that we think of meditation as being something that's relaxing. These practices are not very relaxing. The idea of meditation, the way we use it, because there is a type of meditation which is relaxing, are intended as mechanisms to attain awakening, and they're hard work. They're not all kaihogyo or circumambulation or prostrations and that sort of thing, but they often involve very physical aspects. And the idea is to unite the body, speech, and mind. They're uniting the body, speech, and mind. Did that answer the question?
You're saying the awakening then is, they do this to get rid of the attachments.
Well, the attachments is one. She further asked, they're doing this to get rid of attachments. The attachments are one of the aspects that is a hindrance to awakening. But the very act of the devotion, the chanting, and all those other things lead to attaining awakening. As a matter of fact, the person who does that is perceived as being a living Buddha. The person who completes it is seen as being a living Buddha. Great Baron, did you have a question?
Yes. Is it possible for a person to be a Buddhist as well as a believer in a monotheistic religion?
I didn't hear what kind of religion you said. Oh, monotheistic. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I heard you. Thank you. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm Buddhist. I mean, so, I was raised as a Sephardic Jew. Well, I don't stop being a Sephardic Jew because I'm a Buddhist priest. And Buddhism is non-theistic, so it doesn't address the notion of God. And to be candid with you, some days God exists and some days she doesn't. It really depends upon the day. But it's certainly possible from a Buddhist perspective for someone to be a monotheistic religiousist, if you will, and be a Buddhist at the same time. I have friends who are Buddhist priests and rabbis, friends who are Buddhist priests and nuns, etc. Or, yeah, Buddhist nuns and Christian nuns, etc. So it's certainly very possible. Yeah.
What might be the,
Go ahead.
what might be the rewards for the endpoint if you practice all these things? What is the rewards?
The reward is awakening. That's the bottom line. An awakening means one is the Buddhist, one phrase that we use in Buddhism, it's the path with no goal. And the reason is because if you keep a goal in front of you, often that becomes a kind of hindrance in and of itself. But another aspect of this is that it's search for the nature of reality. And that when one sees the nature of reality, when one sees reality, experiences reality, perceives reality, then one does not have the same kind of limitations on their life that they do previous to attaining awakening. Limitations being the same kinds of anxieties, the same kinds of neuroses and worries and that sort of thing. There was a sort of instructional in this. There was a fellow named Morita, who was a Japanese medical doctor, who lived about the same time as Freud, when Freud was publishing his works. And of course, Freud taught that neuroses is an illness, and that illness can be cured through various methods that he's created. Morita, who actually grew up as a Zen Buddhist, this is a contrast to show you the difference, maintained that everybody's neurotic. It's not an illness that we overcome, it's dukkha. It's that dissatisfactoriness that we spoke about a few minutes ago, and that you can't cure it because it's the nature of the world, but you can decrease its amplification and its frequency. And that's a very Buddhist notion. So that by awakening, you decrease that sense of anxiety, that sense of angst, that sense of limitation. Basically, you become happier. Not ha-ha happy, but a sense of satisfaction, a sense of joy that you don't get when you're very concerned about all those other things. Does that answer the question?
Do we have a question over here, please?
Yes.
Could you just say a little bit more about devotion as a practice?
Devotion as a practice takes many forms. If we look at Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, there are some people who do full prostrations, meaning they get down on the ground, they slide along, and they stand up, and they bow, and then they get down, and they do it again, around a mountain. That's a kind of devotional practice. And they're doing it to open their heart-mind. There's a wonderful practice that I see in Korean Buddhism, for instance, of wonderful little old ladies, typically in their 70s and 80s, who every year do 3,000 prostrations at the same time they're reciting the Heart Sutra and reciting the 3,000 names of the Buddhas as a way to open the heart-mind, as a way to, for those who have had yoga, the heart-mind is actually the third chakra that's right here. It's a way to open that up so that you open yourself to greater compassion, to greater loving kindness, to greater sympathetic joy, and attain equanimity. And that's what devotion is supposed to do. Did that answer the question? Yes. Okay.
Question. I may have missed something. I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
I may have missed something, but what exactly is an awakening, and how does one know that you've achieved it?
Well, let me preface that by saying that if somebody says to you, I'm awakened, run, do not walk to the door. Okay? So anybody who says, I'm an awakened being, just turn around and walk away. Because if they're awakened, they don't need to tell you so. It's as simple as that. The difference is, when we talk about awakening, there's different levels of awakening. One awakening is when you realize that the Buddhist path is a path that the person wishes to walk down. That's one kind of awakening. I'm awakened to that thought. The second kind of awakening occurs in Japanese, is a wonderful term for it, but it's a kind of glimpse into the nature of reality. And that, it's just, let's say when you're meditating, and you have this glimpse into the nature of reality, and during that meditation, all of a sudden, There is no I that's referential. There's no me that's here. And there's no time. The time is displaced. I'm not talking about a kind of out-of-body experience. I'm talking about something in which the individual is fully cognizant of their surroundings, but they have this moment of feeling that as the joke goes, what did the Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor? Give me one with everything. It's not that they believe that they're one with everything, to use that phrase, but rather that there's no distinction between me and you and the other people in this room, etc., in a profound level, not in an intellectual level, but in a transcendent level. And then the next level of awakening has to do with the person who has had those kensho, that's what it's called in Japanese, those momentary glimpses of the nature reality. They become cumulative, and now the person begins to live their life with that sense. It's a more profound transcendence, so that now they have the notion that that when a person is being contentious with them, they're being conflictual, that rather than just getting angry, they're really wondering, they're really sympathizing with that person's suffering that's making them so angry. Does that make sense? Okay.
If there is no eternal soul, what is it that becomes reincarnated or lives on?
That probably takes more time than we have to answer completely. But let me just give you the shorthand of that, because that's really a very involved response. And usually before I respond to that, I give a kind of a declaration, and that is that we don't know, that it's speculative. I mean, there may be people that have died and come back and they say, well, this and this happened, there's some reports of that. Whether that's true or not, I'm in no, at heart I'm a scientist, and I look and say, what's the proof? The way it's taught is that the consciousness that receives the various imprints of actions in this lifetime, good and bad, that's what's reborn. So what is reborn into the conceptus that becomes an embryo, that becomes a fetus, etc., that is the consciousness, not unlike the consciousness that we would use in the vernacular sense. Is the person conscious or not? That consciousness holds on to, the technical term for it is alaya consciousness. It holds on to the seeds of karma that the person had accumulated during this lifetime. Some Buddhists hold that that's true, and some say, you got me. That's the range of thought. But just to give you the answer, that's how it would be answered.
We have a question over here.
Yes.
This is all very attractive, but it seems so cerebral. It's hard to believe that it's so widespread. And how is it possible that someone who is uneducated but is very compassionate, nurturing, loving, has serenity, which this seems to lead to, possibly encompass all of this cerebral stuff?
Right. Yeah. Well, the short answer is that they don't. They're born into the culture. The culture has many mechanisms to assist them along that path. I did a talk not long ago about Ikebana, flower arrangement in Japan. Flower arrangement was started by Buddhist monks as a way for people to not only decorate the altar, the Buddha altar, with flowers, but it also became a way for them to meditate without thinking about meditating. And you could say the same of the tea ceremony. You could say the same of creating haiku. All of those Buddhist aesthetics that we think about were for the most part created by Buddhist monks as a way to have people practice in a way that was more acceptable to them.
But then in your ministry, is everybody pretty intellectual that's coming to hear your wisdom.
No. No, absolutely not. I mean, and it varies from place to place. And before I was talking about the difference, using Obon as an example, and I was talking about the difference between ancestor worship and karma. If I'm doing a funeral in Japan, which I've done many, funeral in Japan to Japanese, the Japanese person, the average Japanese person believes in something called Pure Land, and I'm not getting into that because it's not enough time today to deal with all these distinctions, but it's a belief, right? It's a belief that upon death, that the person's spirit will be reborn in this Pure Land, and that after being cleansed of its impurities, it will then be reborn into human form again to continue on. Now, so there's a kind of heavenly concept that's there, right? Well, you can see how that would be very attractive to people. Their loved one just died, and they want to think that their loved one is going to have a good result of that death. If I'm attending the funeral as a priest, the orthodox part of me, the cerebral part of me, is thinking about the fact that Mr. Suzuki is really an SOB. You know, this guy, I don't care what I did, I couldn't get him to farm organically. He was just so resistant on it. But I'm not going to go and say to his wife, or I'm not going to get up and do the eulogy, you know, as we do here, and say, Suzuki-san was a real SOB. No, I'm going to get up, I'm going to say, Suzuki-san is going to be reborn in the Pure Land. That's compassion. Am I being dishonest? It's not about what I believe, it's about what they believe. They've got to find their own way. And more so, if you ask directly, I maintain that a Sangha, which is the Buddhist congregation, the Sangha looks, a given Sangha, looks very much like the monk or the priest of that Sangha. If you go to my Sangha tonight, half the people there have graduate degrees. Graduate degrees, PhDs and master's degrees. There's a couple of physicians, there's a number of university professors. Virtually everybody has a college degree. If I'm in Japan, it's exactly the opposite. There are very, very few graduate degrees in my congregation at Tamonin, my temple outside of Tokyo in Chiba, Japan. So one of the things about Shakyamuni Buddha is he spoke to the audience in language that they could understand. And so I think that we all do that, not just politicians, but I think all clergy people do it to a certain extent. They have to. And it's true also of Buddhists. So the ideas that I'm talking about, because I'm presenting, if you will, orthodox Buddhism, is very cerebral. And the Dharma talk tonight may be somewhat cerebral or about social responsibility or something along those lines. But the meditation and the Dharma talk after is very much experiential. It's not cerebral at all. It's about the experience that you're having at that particular moment. Did that answer?
We have a question over here.
Yes.
Two statements. One, your presentation was incredibly good.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Two, the average member in a survey in this group has at least a master's degree.
Uh-huh.
My question to you, how did you go from being Sephardim to decide to become a Buddhist priest?
You know, my mother asks herself the same thing every day. I'll answer that very quickly, and I've got a little bit more that I want to do. And I want to go through this a little bit more quickly. But thank you for your kind words. I was raised Sephardic Jewish in the South, which is where most of the Sephardic Jews in America live. And, but when I was in middle school, they didn't call it middle school at the time, they called it junior high. I was about 14. I started reading Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. And by the time I was out of high school, I was studying Buddhism. So I was really studying Asian philosophy shortly after my bar mitzvah. I maintained my orthodoxy. I was an observant Jew until I was about 25. even though I had begun practicing Buddhism actively, doing meditation and that sort of thing from the time I was I was in college. I met a Japanese Buddhist Zen priest and started practicing with him from the time I was in college, and it just kept going on. But I never intended to be a priest. My background is in biological anthropology, and I have done mostly medical anthropology, parasitology and human health and that sort of thing in Brazil, and went to Japan, and I met my teacher there. Studied at Taisho University for 3 years, got a graduate degree again in Asian studies and Buddhist studies, and then to practice the other part, I had to be with my teacher. He gave me a temple to study in direct transmission for another 3 years. When there, I had to take vows in order to study the esoteric practices. And now I'm running around this temple in robes with a shaved head, and people began treating me as a priest because I'd taken vows. And it turned out that there's certain days he had 2 funerals. He couldn't do them both, so I'd have to do one of the funerals. I was just doing it as an intellectual exercise, studying, that is to say. But the term upaya, skillful means, got me to be a priest. And when I left Japan, my wife and I left Japan about 17 years ago, and I was intending to go to Portugal. I had a teaching position in Portugal. And instead I came to the back of the States and started a temple here. That's the short end of the story. Okay. Yeah, one more question, then I'm going to continue.
I'm afraid this question's coming kind of late. It's a big question. We haven't touched on the Bardo and the 49 days. And
okay.
I wonder if you could say something.
What this lady is asking about is the Bardo state, which is the period of becoming. There are 6 Bardo states. The Bardo of birth, the Bardo of dreams, the Bardo of meditation, the Bardo before death, the Bardo at the time of death, and the Bardo of becoming, the 49 days from the time a person dies until their spirit is reborn in another person. And what we're talking about is Bardo literally means transition. And so in the same way that you can imagine when you have dreams, that you perhaps know that you're having a dream. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But you know sometimes that you're having a dream. Sometimes they feel incredibly real, sometimes they don't. The Bardo of becoming, that 49-day period, is asserted to be rather like that. And so it's the time that one travels in this transitory state previous to their consciousness being reborn in another person. Did that answer the question? Did that answer it? Okay. Okay. I'm just going to move along really quickly since we only, well, actually we're here till 6 o'clock, so I guess I can take my time. We view the Buddhist Sangha as being composed of 3 groups. When we look at the spread of Buddhism in Asia, we see that it spread in 2 ways. It spread first, you'll see Bodh Gaya on the map. Let's see, where is it? Here it is, right here. We see Bodh Gaya on the map, and it spread down to the south and then up into this area, which is the Theravada. What are we doing to, okay. And then we see that it also spread from Bodh Gaya in this area up here to western China. This is actually what today would be through Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all that whole area. And then spread east, eventually reaching Korea and then Japan. And it spread this way up into China, and then it spread back into Tibet. Tibet was actually one of the last places for Buddhism to spread to. And that's what is referred to as the Theravada, and we're going to see that in just a second. And so the Theravadan countries today, which I refer to as Shrivakayana, and I won't go into that right now, you can see the dark spaces there. Sri Lanka, Burma, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia are the primary Theravada nations. There's also a fairly sizable Theravada group in Bangladesh, which isn't on here. And the Theravada literally means doctrine of the elders. It's relatively conservative, generally closer to early Buddhism, and as you can see, located in South Asia. Often, this is what Americans think of as Buddhists. Then Bodhisattva Yana, or Mahayana, is in the dark color, encompasses Nepal, Bhutan, China, parts of Mongolia, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Also on here you don't see is Buryat, which is one of the Russian republics, which is also a Buddhist nation. And when we look at the Mahayana, Mahayana means literally greater vehicle. It's the larger of the two divisions numerically. It's less conservative, has a broader base, and you see it primarily in East and North Asia. Then there's the Vajrayana, which is what we think of when we think of Tibetan Buddhism. That's a Vajrayana. Vajra is, in Hindu, it's the thunderbolt. And it means the vehicle of the thunderbolt. And we see the Dalai Lama, who's the head of all of Tibetan Vajrayana. But you find some Vajrayana in Japan also, two schools, Shingon and Tendai. My school, Tendai, is also a Vajrayana school. And it uses mudras and mantras and visualizations, as well as Mahayana scriptures. The difference is the Sravakayana, the Theravada, uses Pali as a formal scholarly language, and it came originally from an oral tradition and existed in an oral tradition for several hundreds of years before it was first written down in about the 2nd century. The Bodhisattvayana, or the Mahayana, used Sanskrit texts, and it was primarily written from the very first. The Sravakayana follows the Vinaya, 250 major rules for men, 320 for women, and some of the Bodhisattvayana uses Vinaya, some uses the Brahmajala, which is the Bodhisattva, which is the Brahmanet Sutra of 10 major and 48 minor vows. So the vows that one takes are different in those two traditions. The Arhat is one who is going to become enlightened upon one's death, whereas in the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva, one who has attained awakening and continues to be reborn to work for the benefit of others, whether it's in this lifetime or others, is the primary form of enlightenment. Sravakayana, it's primarily monastic. Mahayana, it's primarily temples. Monks only are awakened within the Theravada, the Southern Asian Buddhist schools, whereas in the Bodhisattvayana, the Mahayana, both lay and ordained people can become awakened equally. Musong, a really fine writer, and he was the head of the Buddhist Studies Institute in Barre, Massachusetts for a period of time, refers to the Sravakayana as psychological Buddhism, and he refers to the Mahayana as visionary Buddhism. And I think that those terms work pretty well. Conclusion: if you live the sacred and despise the ordinary, you are still bobbing in the ocean of delusion. And this is a short reading list that I'll leave up if people want to take down some of the names. Other questions?
Yes. When you asked us what was the most important thing in Buddhism, you said being compassionate.
Yes.
And it strikes me with the list of all the activities that you related to reach being awakened. That doesn't emphasize a time to be compassionate. Why not struggle in your daily life to be the most compassionate? Why do you need all those other activities?
Those other things.
Emphasizing compassion in the way you live your life.
The question is that I said previously that the most important Buddhist practice is compassion, but then there are so many other methods for practices, such as meditation and devotion and chanting, etc., and that doesn't seem to be compassionate. All of those other activities, such as meditation and chanting, etc., they're methods to go further toward awakening so that you are more compassionate in your daily life. They're specifically structured. The belief is, or I shouldn't say the belief is, the notion is that in our daily life, we're so extremely concerned about getting the kids to the soccer practice or fixing dinner or whatever it may be, that we often don't actually look at compassion. So it's to take that period of time for devotion, chanting, meditation, etc., to actually develop compassion. A really interesting study using PET scans, which are a way of examining the brain in real time. So it shows the brain as it's functioning, changing. We have identified a part of the brain that's associated with meditation. I'm sorry, we've found a part of the brain which is associated with compassion, I should say. A study was done of people who meditated on a regular basis. We're talking about at least half an hour to an hour a day over many, many years. Interestingly enough, the part of their brain that's associated with compassion is up to twice the size as the part of the brain of people who do not meditate. So in other words, those methods are mechanisms by which we attain compassion. And then we can take that compassion out into the world. Does that answer the question?
It's helpful. I wonder if there aren't other methods that
Oh,
are...
there's methods that I'm not even going over. I was just going over some of the major methods. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you very much, and thank you for the mug.